The release of Egypt's former President Hosni Mubarak. Some say it's the strongest sign yet of a return to the old regime and the so-called deep state. Others argue it's a separate issue for the courts and his legal problems may not end there. Just how will this release play out in Egypt's tumultuous revolution? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazm Seeker. Well, after more than 2 years in jail, Egypt's former President Hosni Mubarak has been released. He's now under house arrest after spending his first night out of prison being treated in a military hospital in Cairo. His release comes after a tumultuous few weeks in Egypt and has raised doubts over whether the country's interim leadership has the will to pursue the case against him. Mike Hanna reports from Cairo.
A helicopter rises from the Torah prison. After hours of legal procedure, Hosni Mubarak is released. But his immediate destination is a very short flight down the road, the Mahdi medical facility. His release at this stage is very much a technical term. He will remain under house arrest in terms of a state of emergency decree issued by the interim Prime Minister. A formal ban on leaving the country has also been imposed.
We've lost everything. Now the police state will return, injustice will return, and every other negative thing that we'd hoped would stay away from us is going to come back.
We have an independent judiciary, and I believe that it's enough for him to have left power without using violence against us like the other one, Mohamed Morsi. That alone is more than enough.
Mubarak is expected to be back behind bars in the courtroom on Sunday, when his trial on charges of complicity in the civilian deaths during the 2011 revolution resumes. On the same day, in a different court, leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood that opposed Mubarak for decades will also appear. They stand accused of inciting violence during the demonstrations that followed the military takedown of the Morsi government. The Tamarot movement, the self-styled youth body that spearheaded mass public protest that preceded the military action, has called for courts to strongly pursue the prosecution of Mubarak and Morsi. And ironically, it accuses the Morsi government of not being aggressive enough in taking action against Mubarak, and insists that because of this, Morsi must take responsibility for the release of the man he replaced. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
All right, well, let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. In Cairo, we have Hisham Qasim. He's a journalist and former publisher of el-Masr al-Yawm newspaper. In Berkeley, California, Sarah el-Tantawi, professor of comparative religion and a fellow in Arab studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And here in Doha, Abdullah al-Arian, he's assistant professor of history at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Good to have you all on with us. Sarah el-Tantawi, what do you make then of the news of former President Hosni Mubarak's release?
Well, I think that it is the expected outcome of an extremely flawed trial that has been going on for 2 years. The public prosecutor has not sufficiently heard or accepted the reams of evidence against Mubarak that could have strengthened the case. So from the very beginning, this trial was too soft, and the public prosecutor and the courts did not. The public prosecutor did not accept enough strong evidence against Mubarak, and therefore the courts could not rule on the basis of them. I understand the argument that this is a separate legal procedure that is not connected to political events, but I don't completely buy that. I believe that the release of Mubarak now is very suspicious timing, and I think that what the military government has done is they feel emboldened now that they have operated violently against the Muslim Brotherhood opposition. They're taking advantage of the curfew and the chaotic situation in the country to release Mubarak. So I think that this is clearly a sign of the counter-revolution. But I think the most important point is that this is a counter-revolution not against the Muslim Brotherhood, but against the revolution. And those are two different things. And I think that complexity is extremely important.
al-Arian, your view on this, and in particular the timing of this release with the current events in Egypt right now.
Well, I don't think that this could have been possible under this last regime, the presidency of Mohamed Morsi. I think obviously the events of the last 2 months or so have really led to the point where the release and freedom of Hosni Mubarak is not a very surprising thing. I think that this, yes, I agree, this is definitely a big part of the counter-revolution.
So you see the hand of the military in this?
Absolutely. This is completely politicized. It's been a flawed process judicially, but beyond the judiciary, this really goes to the heart of who really is wielding the strings of power within Egypt, and this has been the military, especially after the coup that ousted President Morsi on the 3rd of July. I think that none of this could have been possible had there still been some kind of recourse, some kind of progress, or some kind of path, however flawed it was, that was transitioning Egypt towards some kind of transitional justice. You can't have transitional justice without a transition, and at this stage we've seen a complete regression back to the politics that defined the January 25th movement that ousted Mubarak in the first place. Now, having said that, this is not necessarily about Mubarak himself. He's clearly not going to play any role whatsoever in the political future of Egypt. I think there's far more at stake now in terms of where we're going from here. That has nothing to do necessarily with Mubarak, but this is clearly symbolic of a much wider problem in which Egypt finds itself in. It's at the precipice, I think, of a return to those old politics of fear, of oppression, of the lack of freedom, lack of social justice.
But what do you say, al-Arian, to those who argue that Mubarak is not out of the woods here yet? If we look at this purely from a legal perspective, there are other cases that are pending against him, and that is something that the courts will have to deal with.
Well, I think that we've seen that there's a lack of political will and a lack of judicial will in order to truly prosecute him. I mean, this should have happened many, many months ago. For it to happen at this point, I think, is very unlikely. I think there was also a sense on the part of the military, and perhaps even on the part of the judiciary, to gauge the public will, to see whether people are going to be outraged by this. And what we've seen, of course, is an incredibly muted response by the Egyptian people to this. We've seen them protest far less offensive and far less glaring injustices over the last 2 years, and yet we've seen almost not a peep coming out of various quarters. The only group, of course, that's been outraged and has continued to demonstrate, not just on this issue, but on all the issues, of course, has been the Muslim Brotherhood and all of their supporters.
Sarah el-Tantawi, you were shaking your head there earlier. What's your view?
Unfortunately, I can't agree with the view that the Morsi government, had we still kept the Morsi government, that this trial would have turned out differently. The evidence actually points in the opposite direction. Hosni Mubarak was out. His trial was overturned on appeal under Morsi, who did absolutely nothing to stem that process, and if anything, let the process go on. The judicial process was flawed from the very beginning, and the Morsi government actually did nothing to reform the process that would have allowed Mubarak to actually stand a true trial.
He tried to remove
and
the
as
public
for
prosecutor.
The last
that was
point
one thing he tried to do.
and as for the last point, that about this so-called muted response, I absolutely disagree with that as well. What I have seen of, first of all, the nation is under curfew, so that is why there are no protests. Then it has been muted because Egyptians are under curfew, but I do not agree at all. I have read and heard a lot of talk about the so-called fourth wave of the revolution. The revolutionaries, which are a separate category. There's overlap, but there's a separate category from the Muslim Brotherhood. I think it's very dangerous now to try to pretend that the Muslim Brotherhood equals the revolution. That is not the case. There's a third way. There are people who are upholding the revolution against anyone who wants to bring in an authoritarian system into Egypt. And many, many people, as we saw on June 30, are quite convinced that the Muslim Brotherhood are in that category.
All right.
So I have seen on social media revolutionaries who are saying, we are going to go out on the streets if Hosni Mubarak is released. This is unacceptable.
All right,
but let's keep in mind that the nation is under curfew.
Let's get Hisham Qasim's view on this. Are you surprised by any of this?
Certainly not. Mubarak is long overdue his release. Mubarak should have been released 4 months ago. And any claim that Mubarak has been released for political reasons is based on the lack of understanding of Egyptian law, where you cannot provisionally arrest somebody pending trial for longer than 24 months, 2 years. Now, the claim that under Morsi it would have not been possible, the only thing that Mohammed Morsi could have done, he had two options. One is to tamper with the law. The second is to put him under detention like Hazem al-Biblawi has. Remember, Mubarak has been released by court under law, but by the martial law, Mubarak has been detained. He cannot leave the hospital bed he's in. So there really is no truth to that, except within the propaganda coming out of the Muslim Brotherhood, claiming that this is the preparation for the return of the Mubarak regime. Now again, we need to understand that the Mubarak regime is being opposed by the whole state.
Sorry to interrupt, Hisham. When you say that this idea that this is a return to the old regime is simply not true. I mean, when you look at what's happening right now, Mubarak has been released from prison for now at least, and you have Muslim Brotherhood leaders who are now being rounded up and are back in jail. Can you blame them for thinking that? Can you blame them for thinking that things have gone back now to pre-2011?
I didn't blame them for it. I just said factually it's not correct, and that's what I'm addressing. Now again, Mubarak set aside the whole foreign ministry. The foreign ministry was sidelined and the intelligence was operating instead of them. They will not allow the return of Mubarak. The judiciary fell out with Mubarak in 2005. They will not allow the return of Mubarak. Media had a difficult time under Mubarak. They will again not allow it. The church was never happy with the way he swept all the problems of Christians in Egypt under the carpet. They will be opposing him. The whole country has moved now, and to try and associate a tie between the existing interim government or even the army and the judiciary that have released Mubarak is groundless. I have suffered from Mubarak. I have opposed this man for 20 years. And yet, from day one, I made it clear, if this man does not get a proper trial, or if due process is not observed, I will move to defend him. Because again, people like myself who worked against Mubarak did not work against him, so that a day comes when we violate the rule of law. We fought for the rule of law, for due process, which he violated. Now, the fact that the table has turned, I personally have no intention of going into the camp of the Mubarak practices which brought him down. There are lots of revolutionaries out there who are saying, oh, there's no due process in the country. For people like myself, if due process is being observed on 10% in this country, 11% is a victory. There has to be modesty. We need to understand it's going to be a slow process, but by holding Mubarak for one more day under trial, it would have been a setback for democracy and for good governance.
Do you think the political will is still there, Hisham Qasim, to pursue these cases against Mubarak?
The political will is far bigger than even the interim government. Remember, this is a nation that moved twice against its leader without leaders. This is the big political will in Egypt. However, the fact that people are not out demonstrating against Mubarak, because Mubarak is a miserable old dictator who has been thrown in jail and humiliated over the past 2 years, and there are much more serious pending issues like malnutrition, for example, in Egypt. That's what people are up against. And most of this polarization and the fight about the release of Mubarak is really up there on the political elite level. But on the street, he's a man behind them. Over their dead body, will he have any say in public life? And even the pillars of his regime, there's no possibility for them to make a comeback.
But let's just widen this out a little bit. When Egyptians revolted against Mubarak in 2011, it reflected their unhappiness with government corruption and police brutality. Now, his release is being seen by some as a sign the military is rolling back the changes that were achieved, as we have been discussing. But it started with a military coup that deposed Mohammed Morsi, Egypt's first democratically elected president. Though it should be mentioned, the coup had support from some Egyptians. General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi took over. He recognized an interim civilian government that would oversee a roadmap to new elections. But it's widely believed the Sisi is the man calling the shots. And in the last 2 weeks, Egypt has seen the return of state security and police to the streets, and 1,000 civilians have been killed in clashes. The interim government has launched a massive crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, saying they are considering disbanding the group. So when we look then, Sarah el-Tantawi, as to when we just saw then how we got to this point, and now we have the release of the former President Hosni Mubarak, it does give the sense to a lot of people that things are all moving in the wrong direction.
Well, I disagree slightly with the way that was set up. I think that there's a tendency to underplay what happened on June 30th, and there's a tendency to underplay the sheer level of dissatisfaction with the Morsi government. There is no doubt in my mind that there was a popular revolt on June 30 in massive numbers all over Egypt, in all of its districts, against the rule of Mohamed Morsi. I gave the Morsi's government a very long chance, even clear through the constitutional debacle of November of last year. But I personally had to conclude after that this is a government that did not seem to have the best interests of Egypt at heart, and seem to put their own personal agenda ahead of that of the national interest. And I find that extremely unacceptable, as did the majority of the a very, very large amount of the Egyptian people. What the Egyptian people did on June 30 was they said, military, who we revolted against 2 years ago, please come in temporarily and relieve us of this government, because we do not have a legal means of doing so, because we do not have a parliament, which is what the Egyptian constitution dictates, that there needs to be a 2/3 vote by the parliament. There was not a parliament. There was no legal means of deposing Morsi. Morsi refused to hold early elections. Morsi refused really any sort of self-criticism, and the Muslim Brotherhood continues in that vein to this day. The Egyptian people invited the army back to remove this president, and my read of the situation now is that the army is taking this too far, taking advantage, and has overread its mandate, again, as Morsi did, who only won by 1.3% of the vote. I'm convinced that this is an ongoing revolution against any form of authoritarian rule, be it military or Islamist. There was a clear voice against the Islamists, and now that it's going to continue against the military.
Abdullah al-Arian, I know you want to respond to what you just heard, and I want to ask you as well about this argument that Hisham alluded to earlier, that things have basically moved beyond Hosni Mubarak and what to do with him. He is an 85-year-old man. He's not in the best of health, and his time has basically passed. Does it even matter that any sort of case in the courts should be pursued against him?
Well, I mean, again, you can't have transitional justice without a transition. There's no current transition taking place within Egypt. The only thing we're seeing right now is a return to the politics of old, except in a far more dangerous form, because I think, as Sarah kind of alluded to, you're basically seeing this sort of popular mandate supposedly given to the military that I think is incredibly dangerous. We've seen what they are capable of doing with that.
Why do you say supposedly? I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of people who filled the streets on that day on June 30th demanding Morsi's removal.
Demanding his removal, not necessarily demanding that the military take over and continue the campaign of rolling back the revolution in the way that it has. I think that's really the danger, and I think we've heard that in the sort of tail end of those comments. I mean, it was a short-sighted move, to be sure. I think there's clearly disputes in terms of whether the numbers are what they were suggested to be. We've seen a lot of analysis after the fact that was far more sobering and I think far more accurate. We've seen also signs at the fact that the entire discontent against the Morsi presidency was manufactured in large part. Of course, he did himself no favors, and the Muslim Brotherhood did themselves no favors by engendering a lot of unpopularity and discontent. But I think we also know that there was a role played by internal and external forces in terms of trying to churn up that kind of discontent against the Morsi presidency. And really, this is something that has been planned from the day that he was elected. Now, I do strongly disagree with the suggestion that there was no other recourse. I mean, if the idea is that we needed a parliament, there was no one that wanted a parliament in place more than Mohamed Morsi himself. He actually tried desperately to try to find some way through, and it was the courts that constantly blocked the election law one time after another. And I think that had parliamentary elections been allowed to happen, the opposition to the Morsi presidency, to the Muslim Brotherhood, could have manifested itself. Those same supposed millions that took to the streets, the same supposed millions that signed all of the petitions, could have organized themselves in a way that actually could have made its way through parliament. They could have reformed or amended the constitution. They could have even brought a vote against the Morsi presidency itself, something that he actually was also willing to do. And of course, the alternative was chosen, and I think a large part of that is because that movement was largely hijacked by other forces, especially those of the counter-revolution, those of the former regime. And we've seen, of course, now what those intentions were all along. It was never about taking Egypt back on the path of some kind of revolution. This was about not only destroying the Muslim Brotherhood, but destroying the revolution as a whole, as it existed in 2011. The idea of going back against the politics of fear, the use of violence and repression. I think those who supported that action on the 3rd of July, the forcible removal of an elected president, it was an incredibly short-sighted move, and one that I think if they haven't already, they will come to regret in the near future.
Hisham Qasim, I want to ask you, as someone who is in Egypt right now, how do you gauge the current political discourse such as it is? Because if you talk to a lot of Egyptians, and that would include people who didn't have much love for Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, but also don't agree with the way all of this is being dealt with the way the interim government and the backed by the military are handling all of this, and they say that there is this sort of climate of fear that is taking hold, that anyone who dares to criticize the current government is immediately labeled as either what they call a terrorist or a Brotherhood sympathizer. What is your view on that?
I challenge what you just said. Like, I challenge your statement that what happened in Egypt is a coup and that a few only people support it. What happened in Egypt was a response to a populist uprising by the military, and the majority of Egyptians support it. And the fact that people are afraid to be critical, I think is baseless.
Why do you say it's baseless? Have you seen people who have been critical?
I'm getting to that. I'm getting to that. Now, I have to admit the media is all support for the interim government and Sisi and the military, okay? But what we have now is the Islamist media has been shut down, I admit that, and then the state-owned media, which would have been supporting Morsi, had Morsi won this fallout that had taken place. And then the secular media, who have a bone to pick with Morsi and are being biased against the man, okay? But the idea that this is a republic of fear and that people are terrified of expressing their opinion, I frankly do not think so. Here I am telling you, I am totally against that the call for Morsi to run for Sisi to run for president. I would be opposed to that completely if it came to that. And we have a roadmap set.
But if you let me ask you this, Hisham, if you criticized anything that the interim government or the military are doing right now, what would happen to you?
Nothing.
You're quite sure in saying that?
Oh, I'm positive. Oh yes, I have no doubt. And I would resist that tooth and nail if somebody tried to suppress me, if it's the interim government or the military. But again, I see no indicators of that. Most of those fears and phobias exist in the Western press that do have a clear position on the matter. They have a reading of this story. They're not yielding. And at present, we really have no option but to proceed with the roadmap and establish that this is completely unfounded within a few months from now.
All right, I want to get Abdullah al-Arian's response to that briefly.
Well, I mean, I think the culture of fear has returned as a result of the mass killings, indiscriminate killings that have been unleashed by this military, the mass wave of arrests and detentions, many of which, of course, unlawful. A lot of the trumped-up charges that we've seen, the intense vilification, not just of the Muslim Brotherhood, but of any opposition figures at this stage. I mean, we know, I have friends and activists and intellectuals there that are receiving visits from Egyptian intelligence agencies. This is exactly like the Mubarak-era tactics. They're being told to stay silent. They're being threatened with detention, arrest, and worse. And I think that this is something that has returned in a very large scale. And it can't be denied. I mean, the facts are there. All of the human rights organizations working on the ground in Egypt have all been documenting these developments for the last 3 weeks or so. It's not something that we can simply sit here and claim that it's not happening because Egyptian media is not reporting on it.
We are unfortunately going to have to leave it there because we are out of time. But I want to thank all three of our guests, Hisham Qasim, Sarah el-Tantawi, and Abdullah el-Arian. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Remember, if you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. And if you're on Twitter, you can tweet me with your reaction at Hazem Sika. Join me 24 hours from now for our weekly look inside Syria. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.